Hello y'all, this is Louie and welcome back to Retrosaurus. I thought we'd take a bit of a break from putting Rareware through the ringer and shift our focus to another well-known series with a mostly forgotten yet somehow classic N64 entry. And I'm using classic as facetiously as possible here, as our subject is one of the most forgettable games I have ever played, especially in recent memory. No, really, even now I'm having the hardest time even recalling what I played of this game, and this was within the past 2 weeks. Castlevania 64 is the forgotten missing link between the 2D platformers we all know and love, and the 3D entries beginning on the PlayStation 2 some of y'all know and love. It truly is one of the more head-scratchy games I've ever played, paling in comparison to its 2D counterparts both in quality and general funness. I'm not even sure if funness is even a word, but just go with it because if Castlevania 64 can somehow exist in not one but two forms, I can distort the English language to my liking. Since I did mention that there were 2 iterations of this game, we'll be focusing on the first one specifically, not the enhanced sequel, remake, or whatever it is, as I'm not made of money and I am loath to even attempt to play it on an emulator. I'm honestly not even sure what they were going for when designing this game, so I'll just give y'all a hearty shrug. CV64 is almost a perfect example of what you would find on the N64 in terms of quality and design. If you were to consider describing any console in particular, you can sum up the library in a few words or even a few examples of the quality and feel from the games found on it. For example, the Super NES is notable for having strong first-party platformers and high-quality visuals and sounds. The PlayStation similarly had a vast library of unique and lively 2D and 3D games with heaps of experimentation in every genre. But when it comes to the N64, I can't really think of a single positive aspect that would properly describe a majority of the combined 388 titles across all regions. But there is a certain something about them that sticks out like a sore thumb. And CV64 isn't even the worst offender, but it definitely was the catalyst in making me re-examine the N64's library as a whole, as I couldn't really pin down what that one thing was in some of the games that didn't resonate with me. If you look at its games, there are plenty of high-profile franchises represented on the system. Some are even considered groundbreaking in certain aspects of their genres or respective series. But it always feels like something is missing that I typically experience when playing games on most other platforms. And today that's what we'll figure out while using CV64 as our unfortunate test subject. So grab your whip, your N64 controller, and your favorite flowy blouse as we return to Castle Dracula to explore the vast emptiness of the N64 library. Full disclosure before we go any further, I'm not what you would call a fan of the Castlevania series. I've attempted and failed to get through many an entry in this inferior Metroid clone of a series. I've only really seen Symphony of the Night through to the end credits, but I was forcibly guided throughout the entire game by an overzealous group of fans who wouldn't let me explore anything on my own. My second attempt at the game resulted in a rage quit fairly early into the game, as some areas were as well planned out as Brandon Flowers' solo career. I did buy Portrait of Ruin upon release, but I never finished it, but I really enjoyed having a dedicated button to make the dual protagonists scream each other's names. But enough about those games. Today we'll be dissecting the aggressively mediocre step-sibling of the series that bore the burden of being the first fully 3D entry in the series. It's not like 3D ever really worked well for the Castlevania series anyway. Not even Patrick Stewart could make up for the terrible Lords of Shadow sub-series, but I digress. As I need a bit of schooling myself on the topic, let's dig a bit deeper into the origins of the series before tearing a new one into the N64 atrocity. Despite contributing to the latter half of the Metroidvania portmanteau, most of the original Castlevania games were closer to linear action platformers in design than the exploration-based 2D entries that began with Symphony of the Night. The original gothic horror action title was developed for the Japan-only Famicom disk system and released in 1986, with the Western localizations being ported to NES cartridges the following May in North America. This was back when Konami had a bit more integrity as a gaming powerhouse, though let's be real, they've always been a bit on the scummy side. The game was helmed by director Hitoshi Akamatsu, who desired to make games with a more film-like, almost cinematic approach. Guess I can blame him for modern gaming. According to an interview with the developers, Akamatsu hoped that players would feel like they were playing through a classic horror film. The game features 18 linear stages divided into 3 level chunks, and stars Simon Belmont, the legendary vampire hunter, on his quest to defeat the evil Count Dracula. The first entry set up many of the mainstays in the franchise, such as whips, heart-shaped magic points, various special sub-weapons, and tight platforming gameplay, all of which are found in some way, shape, or form in most entries in the series. As the premise alludes, the game is heavily inspired inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was celebrating its 90th birthday around the game's release. And not JoJo's Bizarre Adventure like that one dude in my chat keeps telling me. Not everything is a JoJo reference, y'all. The subsequent entries in the series would all share a similar design, though the character's story and some aspects of the game would be altered or changed up between entries to keep things fresh. Heck, even as early as the second entry, Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, they began experimenting with the formula by adding in a day and night cycle, keep that in mind, and a world map with towns and NPCs, almost foreshadowing the path the series would soon take. CV2 comes up a lot with fans of the series as it feels very polarizing and unnecessarily obtuse by design. Actually, that's how I personally describe a lot of older games I've played. Starting with the PlayStation/Sega Saturn entry, Symphony of the Night, the series would begin to take on a more non-linear design, echoing concepts found in CV2, as well as other franchises such as Metroid, in addition to adopting light RPG mechanics such as equipment and experience points. It's interesting that such improvements would be made to this series but were stripped out completely when designing the first 3D entry. Castlevania 64 is unlike its direct console predecessor as it leans more towards the original trilogy of games, specifically Castlevania 2, with little to no RPG mechanics and more focus on platforming and exploration. Really, this game is more like a platforming adventure game more than anything else, as many areas in the game feature little to no puzzle solving or engrossing gameplay design whatsoever. Even worse, the difficulty options in the game are what journalists today would call a slap in the face to gamers if this was released in modern times. There are two difficulty options initially, easy and normal. Easy is basically just an extended demo of the game, as it ends somewhere in the middle of the game after a lengthy and poorly designed bomb delivery section, which was where I first gave up on the game. Normal mode is where the intended experience lies, as it encompasses the entirety of the narrative, for better or worse. I really cannot stress how insulting the implementation of the difficulty options is, as it can easily turn players off from playing through the game once they find out their preferred difficulty is a glorified teaser rather than a proper playthrough. After making strides in perfecting the 2D design of the series, the developers at KCEK, that's Konami Computer Entertainment Kobe, like the beef, set out on their first foray into the 3D game design realm, which surprisingly was not on the PlayStation, which had become the series' new home in recent years. Though maybe it should have stayed there, as at least those games were showing some promise. I'm not particularly sure why the N64 was chosen over the PlayStation for this entry, though I have a feeling it was because the N64 was known more for its 3D prowess, as games such as Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Ocarina of Time, and Glover had all set a standard with their open worlds and graphical fidelity. Additionally, Konami has always been a bit platform agnostic with many of their franchises, so seeing the same series across multiple consoles was not uncommon. As it was their first entry not in the second dimension, it would make sense that they decided to return to the series' roots, as it was somewhat of a reimagining of the original concepts and would allow them to focus on the added depth 3D would give their design choices. Development reportedly began in 1997, showing favorably at Tokyo Game Show 2 years in a row before finally releasing in January 1999 in North America, with Japanese and European releases following shortly after. Initially, the game was going to feature 4 playable characters, but sadly only 2 made the cut, and the others ended up being reworked and added to the updated Castlevania Legacy of Darkness the same year. Really, they released a director's cut of this game less than a year later, almost as if it was a rush release, which is likely given it was intended to be released during the 1998 holiday season. Anyway, although the overall gameplay was somewhat stripped down in terms of depth, combat was beefed up in some respects. Our dual protagonists, Carrie Fernandez and Reinhard Schneider, played quite differently with unique gameplay mechanics and even character-specific levels in their campaigns. Carrie is a bit of a glass cannon, using a dagger or plates or something for short-range melee, and a long-range, overpowered homing magic from a distance. Rob Schneider plays more closely to previous Castlevania heroes, carrying a useless sword for short-range combat and wielding the iconic vampire-slaying whip to whap enemies from afar. Like its 2D counterparts, platforming is the main attraction, but this time in 3D, which meant you'd have to judge distances perfectly when you tap A and pray that you made it across the chasm. The level designs are so uninspired and devoid of atmosphere, you can spend hours walking around looking for where to go, as there are timed events that randomly occur in the game based on a day and night cycle that merely exists in the form of a HUD element. You will occasionally happen upon a door that bears a sun or a moon mark, requiring the player to wait around for the clock to change or find a matching card item to instantly change the time. It's such an odd addition and a callback to an otherwise polarizing entry in the series that really doesn't enhance the game in the slightest. On paper, the game sounds fine, but in practice everything is so lackluster that I'm trying to form the right words to properly describe how obnoxious this game was to play. The game itself is flawed to its core and every aspect of the game falters due to the missteps that were taken. Some of this can be attributed to the dev team being unfamiliar with 3D design or developing for the N64 in general, I guess. But that doesn't really absolve it of its sins. But honestly, these issues are so common in multiple N64 games that it's really unfair to single out this Castlevania duology for its bad design decisions. What I've slowly come to realize is that an obscene amount of games on the N64 are, for better or worse, glorified tech demos and flawed experiments that would lay the groundwork for future games on stronger systems. Gaming was still in its infancy during the 90s despite being decades old at that point, but it was during this console generation that games were emerging as their own distinct form of media instead of an extension of toys. As of this episode, I am 31 years old. I grew up with the Nintendo 64 as my first gaming console that was actually mine, in addition to a now beat-to-heck red Game Boy Pocket. I only owned a couple of games for the system, but I rented the heck out of heaps of games over the years. I generally always held this system in high esteem, call that nostalgia goggles if you will, but I will still stand by Banjo-Kazooie, Paper Mario, and Snowboard Kid Stu being solid entries that still mostly hold up to this very day. But now as an adult, I'm re-exploring this system for the first time in nearly 2 decades, and I'm very surprised at what feels like a complete lack of substance in many of the games I've always heard were must-play gems within the library. At the same time, I'm also exploring the PlayStation library for pretty much the first time in my life, as I didn't have one of those as a kid, and the difference between these two systems is staggering. As a side note, I'd love to throw the Sega Saturn into the conversation as well, but I have very little experience with that system sadly, and the Sega Dreamcast is just a bit too advanced comparatively to really incorporate it, despite sharing some games with both the N64 and the PlayStation. It's really hard to nail down one specific concept or idea that the N64 seems to lack over the original PlayStation. From a pure numbers standpoint, Sony's first console blows Nintendo's first 3D hardware out of the water with 3,072 titles calling the PlayStation their home, with the N64 featuring a combined 388 titles across all regions. Now, this definitely doesn't mean that all 3,000 plus of those games were all winners. There is quite a bit of garbage and shovelware on the original PlayStation, nor are the nearly 400 that made their way to the house Mario built all groundbreaking titles. But with the former's library being roughly 9 to 10 times larger, there's a smaller pool to pick from on the N64, so quality needs to trump quantity. And considering Nintendo's loss of major third-party support after the Super NES era, Nintendo themselves picked up most of the slack with quite a large portion of the library being produced by Nintendo, Rareware, or other second-party developers. So many of those games were marketed as suitable for all ages or just straight up made for kids, which in of itself is not a bad thing, as that's kind of how console games have always skewed. It's always been trendy to criticize Nintendo consoles and games for being only for kids or easily accessible for everyone, so their depth might only be gameplay deep. And honestly, I'd rather take a bunch of solid games that are fun to play than a bunch of faux cinematic Hollywood movie ripoffs that will age as well as Brandon Flowers' second studio album. That is to say, here and forgotten within the first week of release. As the PlayStation started to up the game with more mature or cinematic-oriented titles, Nintendo would eventually follow suit to attract more third-party support to fill that void. When third-party support eventually did make its way to the console, they were either ports or multi-platform games with the occasional original exclusive title. And so many of these feel half-assed, experimental, or devoid of life or soul compared to their cousins on other systems. This is where games like Castlevania 64 come into play. See, we made it back to the game we were supposed to be talking about. CV64 was originally a main series game, though its placement on the timeline was fuzzy and it didn't really feel like many, if any, of the games in the franchise. This would be made abundantly clear years later after Koji Igarashi was placed in control of the franchise and put it, Legacy of Darkness, and Circle of the Moon into their own Gaiden/side story status. By Igarashi's own admission, they were removed as their directors felt like they were side projects and not proper entries, which really does validate my opinion of many of the N64 exclusive entries of popular series. While the PlayStation had become the home of many big names such as Square, Capcom, and Konami, and the de facto home console for many players, games made for Nintendo always felt like side projects or experiments instead of proper, well-planned entries. Let's look back at the moment-to-moment gameplay of CV64. Combat is rigid and stiff, movement is sluggish, it's actually faster to jump everywhere than walk, Corridors are either empty and silent or filled with infinitely respawning enemies, and the platforming gameplay is so unforgiving, as it's hard to gauge the distance that your character can cover without having to reload to save because continues were not a thing at this point in time. Areas were simplistic in nature, with expansive areas filled with dead ends or literally nothing to see, and the environments didn't have much in the way of texture work or great detail. So much of the game feels rushed, and you can see the actual lines where the corners were cut. To be honest, a lot of these issues and complaints can be applied to quite a few big N64 titles, even Super Mario 64. Despite having fantastic movement and gameplay that still largely holds up, the level design of Super Mario 64 feels cobbled together without really any rhyme or reason as to why they are the way they are. It's just kind of eerie how so many big name games are just hollow and vapid with very little substance to them. But honestly, I don't really think this is inherently a bad thing. There's just a disproportionate amount of forgettable games compared to the true must-play gems on the system. For every one Zelda, there are 2 Castlevania 64s. Don't quote my math on this one. And it's kind of the neat thing about the N64. So many of these experiments would lay the groundwork for future games on stronger systems, and the games that are good are still fun to play. You can see ideas from games such as Winback resurface in Metal Gear Solid 2, so while it might not be the most memorable game, it served a greater purpose in the long run, and therefore by extension, Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness after it had to walk in order for Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness to run. Alright, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Retrosaurus. If you liked the episode, make sure to do a thumbs up and leave a comment to let me know what your favorite part was and which game you would like to see me tackle next in the future. If you are interested in supporting this channel, you can do so through Patreon. There's a link in the description, or you can search for KyoryuHunter, which is really easy to find. And speaking of KyoryuHunter, you can find me on all social media networking sites at KyoryuHunter. I am working really hard to get my Instagram back going too, so that's also in there as well. Just search for KyoryuHunter, which is easier to spell than it is to say. Check me out throughout the week, Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. Central Standard Time on my main Twitch channel, where I play a lot of terrible games, specifically a lot more N64 games as of late. And don't forget to check out the other videos on this channel. There are more episodes of Retrosaurus, and there are some other weird ones and LPs out there for you to watch as well. And once again, thank you so much for the support. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time here on Retrosaurus.